Shri Vishnupada Mahamsa Parivraj Kacharya Rashtrataras Shri Srimad Bhagavatam Bhaktivedanta Swami Raj Shri Prabhupada Ki Shri Guru Parampara Ki Shri Chaitanya Charitamrita Ki Shri Shri Mayapur Shri Ki Nitai Gaur Reading from Srila Prabhupada Leelamrita, India, Unifying ISKCON. And we're reading from the description of devotees arriving from all over the world and taking part in the Mayapur festival. Some of the new arrivals, especially temple presidents, were drawn into the schism regarding grihastas and sannyasis. Now that all the temple presidents were together, they called for a special meeting, rallying together in their discontent. They disliked the resolutions restricting the place of grihastas in ISKCON, and as they spoke and compared opinions, they found a particular focus for their grievances. Most of the objections were coming from the North American temple presidents and were aimed at the Radha Damodar travelling Sankirtan party led by Tamal Krishna Goswami. The conflict had been building for at least a year, ever since Tamal Krishna had formed the Radha Damodar party. Within that year, the party had grown to about 150 men, travelling all over North America and distributing Srila Prabhupada's books. Prabhupada had praised the party, which was responsible for 30 to 40% of the total remittances to the American BBT. Men on the Radha Damodar party lived with spiritually advanced sannyasis. They developed traits of austerity and detachment and had an enthusiasm for remaining celibate without a need for marriage. The Radha Damodar party broke all records for book distribution and outdid all other zones and temples. An elite army of Sankirtan soldiers, they were the recognized world leaders of book distribution. More than 80 members of the party had arrived at the Mayapur festival, and they were given a special reserved section in the best building for their residence. But in their zealousness for renunciation and Sankirtan leadership, some of the Radha Damodar brahmacharis had developed a condescending attitude toward temple life and householders. This materialistic conception had reached the point where some men were judging the worth of a devotee on the basis of whether he wore white cloth as a grihasta or saffron as a sannyasi or brahmachari. Anyone in white could not be a spiritually advanced devotee. At least this was the misconception that the temple presidents felt had developed among some of the more immature members of the Radha Damodar party. The greatest grievance, however, was more practical and philosophical. The presidents claimed that the Radha Damodar party was stealing men from the temples. The temple presidents compared stories and cited numerous instances to prove that men had been lured from their services in the temples to join the Radha Damodar party. The philosophy that sannyasis were superior to grihastas, the president said, was being used in an opportunistic way to convince men, the very best brahmacharis, to give up their posts in Prabhupada's temple and join the Radha Damodar group. This often caused serious difficulties. The temple presidents considered the preaching of the Radha Damodar party to be unbalanced and selfishly motivated. So acute had the disagreement grown that some temples had forbidden the Radha Damodar party to visit, and some had banned Radha Damodar sannyasis from lecturing to the devotees. The Radha Damodar men, however, saw these restrictions as further proof of the householders' small-mindedness and attachment. Srila Prabhupada bided his time on the volatile issue and went about his duties receiving guests and supervising the management of the Mayapur temple and the festival. He was lecturing daily in the temple and satisfying everyone. To his servants and secretaries, however, he revealed that the schism was causing him anxiety. That the temple presidents were angry disturbed him. One afternoon he could not even take his nap because of worry. "This is a very serious thing," he said to Hari Sori during the massage, "this difference of sannyas and grihastha. Everything will be spoiled." Hari Sori compared the present schism to the schism that destroyed the Gaudiya Math. Another time, when sitting in his room, Prabhupada picked up a decorative bookmark a brahmachari had made for him. "Such nice service," he said, "how can it be refused? I have never stopped them serving, simply..." That's very nice. Another time, when sitting in his room, Prabhupada picked up a decorative bookmark a brahmacharini, female brahmachari, had made for him. "Such nice service," he said, "how can it be refused? I have never stopped them serving simply because they are women." Rameshwara came to Prabhupada's room and showed him some of the recent BBT publications. They discussed their business, turning at last to the sannyas grihastha issue. As Rameshwara began to offer his opinion, Prabhupada asked that other available sannyasis and GBC men come in for the discussion. Rameshwara was championing the temple's cause, relating some of the financial and practical problems the temples were experiencing due to losing men to the Radha Damodar party. When men left, then book distribution declined in those temples. In the face of the heavy propaganda for joining the travelling bus parties, how could the loyal temple devotees remain satisfied collecting money mostly for maintaining the temples without being able to afford to distribute books? The temple devotees also wanted to have the ecstasy of book distribution, but that was becoming increasingly difficult due to the crippling tactics of the travelling bus parties. Rameshwara asked Srila Prabhupada to clarify the philosophical misconception that grihasthas were not advanced enough to manage the brahmacharis. Prabhupada mentioned the sannyasi Chota Haridas, whom Lord Chaitanya had rejected for only slight association with a woman. Yet Lord Chaitanya had embraced a grihastha, Shivananda Sen, on learning that Shivananda Sen's wife was pregnant. Prabhupada said that although Lord Chaitanya's relationship with his sannyasis was different than his relationship with his grihasthas, both were transcendental. The grihasthas were encouraged to perform family duties and raise Krishna-conscious children. Addressing the sannyasis present, Prabhupada said that for them to be dwelling so much on the activities of the householders was inappropriate. It meant that the sannyasis were thinking about sex more than the householders were. If the sannyasis were talking all day long about married life, they would become contaminated. Prabhupada then told a story to illustrate his point. Once two Brahmins were about to cross a river when a lady appeared in need of assistance in crossing. So one of the Brahmins offered to carry her on his back. The other Brahmin was shocked, but refrained from saying anything. After crossing the river, the lady thanked them very much and went her way. The two Brahmins continued walking, but for hours the other Brahmin continued to talk about the incident. "You let that woman climb on your back and touch your body," he said, and he continued talking. Finally, the other Brahmin corrected him. "I carried her on my back for 10 minutes, but you have been carrying her on your mind for 3 hours. Srila Prabhupada ki.
Jai.
So we're reading from Chaitanya Charitamrita, Madhya Lila, chapter 17. The Lord travels to Vrindavan. So we're starting from text 128. And we'll read through to text 132. Jaya Jaya Sri Chaitanya Jaya Nityananda
Sri Chaitanya Jaya Nityananda
Jaya Dvaita Chandra Jaya Gaura Bhakta Vrinda Jaya Jaya Sri Chaitanya Jaya Nityananda Jaya Dvaita Chandra Jaya Gaura Bhakta Vrinda Jaya Jaya Sri Chaitanya Jaya Nityananda
Jaya Jaya Sri Chaitanya Jaya Nityananda
Jaya Dvaita Chandra Jaya Gaura Bhakta Vrinda
Jaya Dvaita Chandra Jaya Gaura Bhakta Vrinda
Hare Krishna 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 Hare Hare
Hare Krishna 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 Hare Hare
Hare Rama 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 Hare Hare
Hare Rama 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 Hare Hare.
Text 128. It's got the Bhagavatam up there. Anyway, so by the time you get there, one verse 132 of the Chaitanya Charitamrita Vrinda, by the time you get there. Ihara karanamore ka kripa kari toma deki moki mora bali Krishna Hari. Why could Prakashananda not utter the names Krishna and Hari? He chanted the name Chaitanya thrice. As far as I am concerned, simply by seeing you, I am moved to chant the holy names Krishna and Hari. Prabhu kahi mayavadi Krishna aparadi Brahma Atma Chaitanya kahi niravadi. Sri Chaitanya Mahaprabhu replied, the Mayavadi impersonalists are great offenders unto Lord Krishna. Therefore they simply utter the words Brahman, Atma and Chaitanya. Atayeva taramukena aishe Krishna nam Krishna swarup tuita samam. Because they are offenders unto Krishna, the Supreme Personality of Godhead, who is identical with his holy name, the holy name Krishna does not manifest in their mouths. Nama vigraha swarup tina ekarupa tine vedanahi tina chidananda rupa. The Lord's holy name, his form and his personality are all one and the same. There is no difference between them. Since all of them are absolute, they are all transcendently blissful. Deha dehira nama namira Krishna nahi ved Jivare dhamma nama deha swarupe vibhed. Please repeat. Deha dehira, of the body and the owner of the body. Nama namira, of the name and the owner of the name.
Of the name and the owner of the name.
Krishna,
in
Krishna.
Nahi Veda.
There is no difference. Jivaradama, the situation of the conditioned soul. Nama, name. Deha, body. Swarupe, original form. Vibheda, different. Translation. There is no difference between Krishna's body and himself, or between his name and himself. But as far as the conditioned soul is concerned, one's name is different from one's body, from one's original form, and so on. Please repeat. There is no difference between Krishna's body and himself.
There is no difference between Krishna's body and himself.
Or between his name and himself. But as far as the conditioned soul is concerned, one's name is different from one's body.
One's name is different from one's body.
One's original form. And so on. Purport by Srila Prabhupada. Srila Prabhupada ki Jai. Sri Chaitanya Mahaprabhu is herein pointing out to the Brahman that Mayavadi philosophers cannot understand that the living entity is equal in quality with the Supreme Personality of Godhead. Because they do not accept this, they think that the living entity has been falsely divided from the original Brahman due to being conditioned by Maya. Mayavadis believe that the absolute truth is ultimately impersonal. When an incarnation of God or God himself comes, they think he is covered by Maya. In other words, Mayavadi impersonalists think that the Lord's form is also a product of this material world. Due to a poor fund of knowledge, they cannot understand that Krishna has no body separate from himself. His body and himself are both the same absolute truth. Not having perfect knowledge of Krishna, such impersonalists certainly commit offences at his lotus feet. Therefore, they do not utter Krishna, the original name of the absolute truth. In their impersonal way, they utter the name of impersonal Brahman, spirit soul. In other words, they indulge in indirect indications of the absolute truth. Even if they happen to utter the names Govinda, Krishna or Madhava, they still cannot understand that these names are as good as Govinda, Krishna or Madhava the person. Because they are ultimately impersonalists, their uttering of the personal name has no potency. Actually, they do not believe in Krishna, but consider all these names to be material vibrations. Not being able to appreciate the holy name of the Lord, they simply utter indirect names like Brahman, Atma and Chaitanya. It is a fact, however, that the name of Krishna and Krishna the person are both spiritual. Everything about Krishna is transcendental, blissful and objective. For a conditioned soul, the body is different from the soul, and the name given by the Father is also different from the soul. The conditioned living entity's identification with material objects keeps him from attaining his actual position. Although he is an eternal servant of Krishna, he acts differently. The swarup, or actual identification of the living entity, is described by Sri Chaitanya Mahaprabhu as Jivara Swarupoi Krishna and Nityadas. The conditioned soul has forgotten the real activities of his original position. However, this is not the case with Krishna. Krishna's name and his person are identical. There is no such thing as Maya. There is no such thing as Maya Krishna, because Krishna is not a product of the material creation. There is no difference between Krishna's body and his soul. Krishna is simultaneously both soul and body. The distinction between body and soul applies to conditioned souls. The body of the conditioned soul is different from the soul, and the conditioned soul's name is different from his body. One may be named Mr. John, but if we call for Mr. John may never actually appear. However, if we utter the holy name of Krishna, Krishna is immediately present on our tongue. In the Padma Purana, Krishna says, Yatra Gayanti Madbhakta Tatra Tishtami Narada. O Narada, I am present wherever my devotees are chanting. When the devotees chant the holy name of Krishna, Hare Krishna, Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Rama, Rama Rama, Hare Hare, Lord Krishna is immediately present. Translation again. There is no difference between Krishna's body and himself, or between his name and himself. But as far as the conditioned soul is concerned, one's name is different from one's body, and from one's name is different from one's body, from one's original form, and so on. Amagyanativandasya gananjana shlakaya chakshurmanitam yena tasmai shri gurve namaha I was born in the darkest ignorance, but my spiritual master has forced open my eyes with the torchlight of knowledge. I offer a respectful obeisances unto him. Anshikapatarubyascha kapasindavyevacha patitanam bhavanebhyo vaishnavebhyo namo namaha. I offer respectful obeisances unto all the Vaishnava devotees of the Lord who can fulfill the desires of everyone and are full of compassion for the fallen conditioned souls. Jaya Shri Krishna Chaitanya Prabhu Nityananda Shri Advaita Gadadhara Shri Vasi Gaura Bhaktivinoda Hare Krishna 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 Hare 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 Rama 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 Hare Hare. In the beginning of the purport, Srila Prabhupada said that the Mayavadi philosophers cannot understand the nature of the living entity and the nature of the living entity's relationship with Krishna, the Supreme Personality of Godhead. And because that knowledge of Krishna's existence as the Supreme Personality of Godhead and the relationship between Krishna and his eternal servants, the Jivas, because of that, the essence, the essential nature of that knowledge, and because the Mayavadis can't understand that essential knowledge, then all other knowledge that they talk about, discuss, study, it has a faulty foundation, and therefore it's not correct. So all of the theories that they develop about the absolute truth, about the situation of the living entity, about the nature of illusion, about the relationship between the living entity and Brahman, all of that knowledge is actually faulty because they've rejected this Achintya-Bheda tattva, that the living entity is equal in quality with Krishna, although the living entity is infinitesimal, whereas Krishna, the Supreme Person, is infinitely great. So Srila Prabhupada says it's not possible for them to understand because they've rejected that original premise. As Srila Prabhupada says, the Swarup or actual identification of the living entity is Jivara Swarupaya Krishnara Nityadas. The living entity is eternally the servant of Krishna. So this is this knowledge is unacceptable to the Mayavadis, and this is really the root cause of their putting forward their philosophy of Maya Krishna, and that they put forward, was it Rama Satya Jagat Mithya, that the only real reality is the impersonal Brahman, non-differentiated Brahman, non-differentiated spirit, and that all variegated manifestations are temporary and ultimately illusory. Srila Prabhupada says this is due to a poor fund of knowledge, and yet they devote their whole lives to study, and they also, and before they had to reading Srila Prabhupada instituted the Brahmacharya ashram so that devotees of Krishna could develop a mood of austerity and a mood of being the servant. This is actually the purpose of the Brahmacharya ashram, is to develop humility. But through the austerities of the Mayavadis, they don't develop humility. they actually develop pride because they've got nothing else to be, they've got no other source of pleasure because they perform so many austerities. Then their only form of pleasure is to relish their knowledge of what they consider to be the absolute truth. And because that knowledge is faulty, then it becomes, then with that pride, they become more and more inimical to anyone who presents a challenge to their philosophy. And they become inimical to such a stage that they become offensive to the devotees of Krishna. But Lord Chaitanya had already decided to deliver everyone, even the Mayavadis. And this is one of the reasons that he took sannyas. So it's described in the Adi Leela, chapter 7 of the Chaitanya Charitamrita. Seeing that the Mayavadis and others were fleeing, Lord Chaitanya thought, I wanted everyone to be immersed in this inundation of love of Godhead, but some of them have escaped. Taha deki Mahaprabhu karina chintan, jagat duvaite ami karilan yatan, kea edi ila pratigya haila banga, ta sabha duvaite patiba kichuranga. Therefore I shall devise a trick to drown them also. Srila Prabhupada says in the purport, here is an important point. Lord Chaitanya Mahaprabhu wanted to invent a way to capture the Mayavadis and others who did not take interest in the Krishna consciousness movement. This is the symptom of an acharya. An acharya who comes for the service of the Lord cannot be expected to conform to a stereotype, for he must find the ways and means by which Krishna consciousness may be spread. So the Chaitanya Charitamrita is a wonderful book of the tricky ways in which Lord Chaitanya attracts people to Krishna, and especially in this section of him attracting the Mayavadis of Varanasi. This was considered the most amazing conversion, or the most amazing transformation, because not only were they in illusion, but they'd become so proud of their illusion that they were regularly offending devotees and also offending the Supreme Lord. So it's interesting, we were reading in Srila Prabhupada's Leelamrita that Srila Prabhupada considered the book distribution to be the best means for delivering persons who'd been contaminated by this Mayavadi philosophy, because it actually pervaded the whole world. Just as it's described, when the holy name is chanted, then the whole world benefits from that vibration. So, but actually, because the philosophy of the Mayavadis was propagated so widely, that it actually infected the whole world. And Srila Prabhupada understood that it was necessary for people to read his books, which were the condensed teachings of the Acharyas, to be able to understand the threat of impersonalism. So Srila Prabhupada was certainly very pleased that thousands of his books were being distributed. And actually there's a letter which Srila Prabhupada wrote to his manager of his book distribution, Rameshwara Prabhu. And this was in 73 in January. So it was just after the time when devotees were distributing large numbers of Krishna books in New York at Christmas time. And Srila Prabhupada wrote to Rameshwara saying that he was amazed that devotees had managed to distribute 17,100 copies of Krishna book during the 3-day period leading up to Christmas. However, he was most pleased by the fact that to be able to do that, and they must have gained a real taste for reading his books and a real taste for hearing and chanting. So when Srila Prabhupada says that due to a poor fund of knowledge, then the Mayavadis were unable to understand the relationship between Krishna and his devotees. So Srila Prabhupada was also concerned that devotees were, by putting too much stress on just distributing books and neglecting their spiritual activities, then they weren't actually nourishing their spiritual creepers, that they weren't developing a sufficient fund of knowledge to protect them from illusion and from the dangers of impersonalism. So this is like that pastime we read from Mayapur, then that displays that Srila Prabhupada was saying that that the brahmacharis were like becoming too concerned about externals, and this was an indication that they weren't actually absorbing the knowledge on a deep level. So it's actually, there's a very, yesterday I was writing a letter to some of our congregational members who receive Back to Godhead magazines once every 2 months. And the most recent issue has an article by Vishakadevi Dasi, one of Srila Prabhupada's disciples, who is now the temple president of Bhaktivedanta Manor. And in that article, which is called Our External and Internal Missions, and she gives a very nice analogy that our mission, the mission of ISKCON, is benefiting the world in the way that a tree benefits a community, or in the way that a tree benefits the environment, and that the benefits of the tree come from the top of the tree, or the crown, or the leaves, and the fruits are. That's how it's benefiting living entities from its fruits, and it's giving off oxygen. But unless the roots of the tree are very well nourished, then there won't actually be it won't be a sustainable system. So Vishakadevi Dasi was quoting that letter which Srila Prabhupada wrote to Rameshwara about how he was so pleased that 17,100 books had been distributed. And like many devotees have that letter, right? Many book distributors have that letter and they have it copied because it's a very famous letter. But actually right at the very end of the letter, then Srila Prabhupada says, Srila Prabhupada says, by utilizing our energy in this way to give everyone access, that is the real understanding of the desire to serve humanity. Understanding is one thing and practical application of that understanding is another. But as devotees of Krishna, being engaged in the practical work of spreading Krishna consciousness, that is already the highest realization. That is all right. That is our real mission, to deliver the world by preaching the message to others. But an even higher realization, the highest realization, is to save oneself. So, in that analogy, Vishaka Devidasi describes that the roots of the tree need to be constantly nourished by hearing from Krishna in the form of the Bhagavad Gita and the Srimad Bhagavatam, from hearing from Krishna's devotees, and from hearing the holy name. And in this way we'll be able to will be able to grow a strong trunk and branches that will actually cooperate with each other because they'll both have the same foundation. And then automatically the leaves and the fruits will nourish like other living entities, other communities around us. So, and this is the whole, an understanding of this is gained from attentive hearing and chanting. So I'll stop there. Are there any questions or comments?
So that was a nice point that you were making. Saying yourself. So somebody who doesn't know much about Krishna consciousness, say like a mundane moralist, he would say, well, surely the example of saints is that they sacrifice themselves for the good of everybody else. They allow themselves to be crucified or whatever else. And surely isn't that the higher principle, to forgo your own consideration and your own self-interest and just want to see everybody else saved?
Yes, well that's a manifestation of the highest principle, which is to save oneself. So persons, great saints and avatars, who they're constantly in contact with the spiritual energy which is coming through pure spiritual scriptures or coming directly from the spiritual world. Because that's their constant food, that's their constant nourishment. And only because of that nourishment are they able to sacrifice their lives or devote their entire lives to the welfare of others. And they don't neglect the material or physical well-being of others, because they understand that the world has been designed to allow human beings and other living entities to have a balanced life in which they can fulfill material and spiritual needs, but that without the spiritual nourishment, then both the physical and the spiritual will very quickly decay. And we can definitely see that in our present society, that due to a lack of spiritual leadership, and although there's a great deal of economic research and a great deal of even environmental research, as we know, all of the predictions, which the scientists gave about the environment 50 years ago, about the greenhouse effect and the ozone layer and all of those predictions, they were there, but because there were no spiritual leaders to actually, who had the courage to guide, well, it's not that there weren't any spiritual leaders, but because there were so few spiritual leaders, or so few people empowered with spiritual knowledge, there was no possibility of leading the people towards the necessary measures. So we all have a responsibility to become very strong spiritually. Like there's a lot of talk now about resilience and transition and transformation. So we need to be very resilient so that we can tolerate whatever difficulties and challenges we face in the world. But we should understand that resilience can only come through like a good fund of knowledge, actually understanding our relationship with the source of all energy. And in that way, when we're very grounded in spiritual knowledge, then we can impart that strength to others. And that's the greatest gift we can give someone, is to give them total resilience. Anything else which we try to give to people can only be very temporary. So it's very important, and in that, it's more important that what we communicate is based in truth. That's the most important thing, because then there can be a succession of that knowledge being passed on. If we sacrifice like a little bit of truth for a vast amount of material progress, it may last for like 1 or 2 generations, but after that there'll be nobody to restore it again. So this is the most important thing.
Yeah, I think also Prahlad Maharaj resonates that same point, doesn't he? He says, I've got no concern for myself, and he's just worried about the frozen rascals, and because he's already saved, as you could say, and he's reached that point, and so that's how you can see a real compassion. It won't be obstructed anymore. It's hard to care about other people. It's like a doctor, right? If the doctor's healthy, he's got much more chance of taking care of everybody on the ward than if he's crippled with some debilitating disease himself. So if the doctor can get himself 100% fit, then he's going to be a lot more efficient and a lot more effective in attending to everybody else's needs, isn't it?
Yeah. Rather
than going around half dead, preoccupied with all his own ailments, and at the same time trying to actually becomes a disservice to everybody, isn't it?
Yes, actually it's nice you brought up that example of Prahlad Maharaj, because shortly after that conversation between Prahlad and Nrsingadev, Lord Nrsingadev, Lord Nrsingadev tells Prahlad to perform the funeral ceremonies for his father, Hiranyakashipu. And Srila Prabhupada comments that actually it wasn't actually necessary for Prahlad to do that, because Hiranyakashipu was like so fortunate to have a son like Prahlad. So he'd already been delivered. But Srila Prabhupada comments that, but because Lord Nrsingadev wanted Prahlad to become the king, then he wanted him to set the example for future generations, so that even after Prahlad had left the planet, he wasn't going to assume that the next king was going to be a pure devotee like Prahlad. So for that reason, it is our responsibility not just to impart the pure spiritual teachings, but also to understand the kind of social system and like the environmental stability that's necessary so that people can in the future embrace spiritual teachings. So that's a very difficult challenge, to be able to do those both things together. And it's kind of that challenge is sometimes manifest in this dichotomy between, how much energy to put into establishing stability in society, in the broader society, and how much energy to put into developing our own spiritual strength within our community. But but as time goes on, we're learning more and more from the lessons of the past. It's one wonderful benefit of the internet is we can learn very easily, much more easily now from the lessons from the past, because we've got so much more access to all of the information that's gone on. And that's what that article in the BTG is all about, how to balance external and internal missions. So I recommend anyone who hasn't read it, if anyone's got the Back to Godhead magazine and they haven't read it yet, then please read that article, it's very nice. And if you don't have a Back to Godhead magazine, then we can arrange to send you one.
At a very nominal amount.
Yeah, or if you're too anxious, you can also might be able to access it online, although usually you can't access it immediately.
There's a nice one comes up as well. What was saying? I was asking him there's a lot of things now. It was on that program by Namaras, the late morning program, that there's a lot of things we do now that weren't done when Srila Prabhupada was here. And there's a lot of things that aren't done now that weren't done when Srila Prabhupada was here. So I was asking, are we upgrading or are we downgrading? And he was saying, well, there's more social stability now. We used to have sannyasis coming and going, and we got married in the 70s to stay together. But now things are much more stable, and we have more resource now, more access to resource because of so many things, internet, books, so many recorded lectures, and so easy to just access them. So because of that, then we're actually upgrading, we're becoming more seasoned and understand better, the pitfalls.
Yeah, and also because of that, as Sri Krishna mentioned in a class a couple of weeks ago, or maybe just a week ago, that when a community of devotees are chanting and dancing for Shri Gaur Nitai or for Shri Radha Krishna, then the energy that's suffused from the appreciation of the deities actually means that everyone in that environment becomes happy, and it ripples out not just to the devotee community, but it actually ripples out into the world also, so that that energy facilitates more smooth functioning of the material energy. The material energy being actually one of Krishna's energies. So it's actually the more I look at the material world now and the different concerns that people have about social injustice and environmental disaster, the more I see that actually the way things are meant to be are starting to work. It's like the energy is actually starting to facilitate people to act in ways which are beneficial for society. And it's in one sense it's good to look at it because it takes a little bit of the pressure off ourselves to feel that we have to establish that society in the way that Lord Nrsimhadev wanted Prahlad to establish it. Because in Kali Yuga it's so difficult. There's so many different parties and cultures and political groups, and like to try to please everyone is absolutely impossible. But Krishna can do it, and if we try to please Krishna by focusing on our devotion in our own lives, in our own daily practice, whether it's in the temple or whether it's in our own homes, and then by watering the root of the tree, then the whole tree will be nourished, not just spiritually, although it's actually all spiritual from Krishna's perspective, but also things will start to function in a way that will facilitate Krishna consciousness spreading. So it's nice actually. Richard, one of our yoga teachers, is shortly going to be starting some courses on therapeutic gardening. So, so we look forward to that, Richard. And so I'll stop there. Shri Chaitanya Charitamrita ki, Srila Prabhupada ki, Shri Kundlitai Vaikuntha ki, Nitai Gaura Premanandi.